Back to class.
All right, well, we're on our last couple of class periods here, and for that we'll be discussing James Hillman for today and next time, and then the class period after that we'll have our final exam, which will be open book and should be actually very easy into making those really difficult for people. The main thing is that you've been here and gotten something out of it and enjoyed it, and that these ideas have spoken to you in some way. Now, with respect to James Hillman, we might say that the history of Western civilization, there are these two great modes of thinking, the conceptual and the mythic, and we have seen this in counterplay all through the course here. And oversimplifying, we might say Young would polarize them as thinking versus intuition, or left brain, right brain, which is the vogue nowadays because cognitive psychology is the in thing, and they're very physically oriented, and they bring in brain surgeons and so forth. And there's good evidence that the left brain does indeed understand things in terms of concepts, and that the right brain has a lot to do with perception and perception of images in particular. And the conceptual and the mythic, we might say that the counterplay between them, the tension between the two of them, really has made up the history of Northern European civilization. And we might also frame it in terms of the history of Western civilization, and particularly with respect to science versus religion, has been a gradual translation of the mythic into the conceptual. And by mythic, we mean to subsume both traditions, the mythic mainstream, which is the Bible and the Christian vision, and the mythic substream, which is astrology, alchemy, the Hermetic tradition, and Gnosticism generally. Both are mythic. And science has essentially absorbed both of those traditions and translated it into an armada of concepts. You might even say that you could do something like look at Newton's vision of the cosmos and say that that vision that Newton dreamt up would not even have been possible without the biblical vision behind it, because what we have there is a universe of forces moving masses about. And the external force is primarily gravity, which acts upon objects from a distance, and it gets weaker the further two objects are apart from each other. And the only force that objects have innately in the Newtonian system is inertia. They have a tendency to simply fly in a straight line to infinity, except that gravity deflects that, pulls the planets, and begins to spin them around this way. But the planets themselves would not be orbiting around the sun were it not for the external force of gravity, which is deflecting their desire to fly off to infinity. And that's the kind of Newtonian model. But what you have there really is a translation into scientific discourse of the biblical vision of a God who is absolutely ontologically separate from his creation, and matter is incapable of self-motion. It is not alive, it is fallen, it is dead, and anything that comes about, anything that is created, is the imposition of the external force of God, of the Spirit, coming down and manipulating matter externally, as in Genesis 2, where he molds a ball of clay and creates Adam out of it. So the Newtonian vision is essentially really quite consistent with Christianity and its translation of spirit versus matter into the scientific language of forces moving masses about is quite deliberate. So as we go along through the history of the West, and we look at the great revolutions, starting with Columbus, we saw what happened with the Columbian Revolution, where all the maps were redrawn, and then with the Copernican Revolution, all the astronomical maps are redrawn because everything now has to be centered around the sun, whereas before it had been centered around the earth. One by one, blow after blow after blow, the biblical vision, the mythic vision of the cosmos disintegrates, deteriorates, as fact after fact is marched out, culminating with Darwin's theory of evolution and the Einsteinian vision and quantum mechanics at the turn of the 20th century. That really kind of wrapped it up as far as this archaic cosmology was concerned. So the cosmology became interiorized, and psychology was born because, as it were, everything that through Western civilization had been mythically projected cosmologically onto the universe had no place to go, and now introjected down into the depths of the psyche, where it began to activate, and the stuff is just in there churning, and psychology comes along as the discipline that is devoted to examining these mythic ideas, whereas the sciences, on the other hand, proceed on the assumption that they have stripped and literalize the cosmos of all mythic and metaphoric references. So everything is just what we say it is. A cup is just a cup, an object is an object, and it has no more significance than that. Well, now Hillman's whole approach, and Hillman himself is part of a larger movement that is going on now within the sciences of a shift backwards into the mythological imagination. Hillman's primary endeavor is to translate the conceptual language of science back into the mythic prototypes. And this is essentially tantamount to an absorption of the conceptual by the mythic, of the left brain conceptual language by the right brain. And this has been going on. Hillman's purpose is very specific, but my book, for example, Twilight of the Clockwork God, was dedicated to interviewing a series of scientists, all of whom take mythology seriously and have been doing this process of translating concepts back into myths. James Lovelock, for example, with the Gaia hypothesis, earlier on in the century, possibly at the turn of the century, would never have felt the need or recourse to have the mythic image of Gaia. He simply would have called it Earth system science, and that would have been consistent with the vogue or the conceptual zeitgeist of that time. But now the zeitgeist is shifting from the left brain, from concepts to images, to the right brain, to the iconic mode of thinking. And Hillman is trying to do this specifically within the realm of psychology, and so that's what we're looking at. So this gives you a sense of what Hillman's up to and what his aim is before we get into.
Can you back up 1 second? Are you saying that, I don't know if I missed something here, but or whether this sums it up? Are you saying that the zeitgeist is shifting from left brain to the right is the reason why why there's a push to translate the conceptual back into the mythic? Or do you think that there's something else going on which correlates with that?
I wouldn't try to pin a cause on it. I would just say that's what's happening. That shift is taking place, and different philosophers are going to have different opinions about what's causing it. I don't know what's causing it. I don't know
I want you to tell me what's causing it.
Well, once we get in, the problem with that is the category of causality is the primary instrument that the waking consciousness uses, the rational consciousness uses to make constructions, linear constructions out of things, cause and effect. A is the cause of B. And the traditional notion of causality is that event A is the direct result of event B, and without A we don't have B. So it has to proceed in this machine-like, sequential, first A, then B, then C, almost like the alphabet. But the kind of causality that we're talking about is like the causality that Rupert Sheldrake discusses in my book with respect to morphic resonance, which is the causality of the iconic imagination. Is A is the cause of B, and it's also the cause of C, and B is the cause of C, and it's also the cause of the next thing, and so on. We get all these causes impinging on each other, so that we have something that's closer to a vision of the Far East with the idea of everything is mutually conditioning everything else. And so we have this shift from very specific sequential reasoning to everything all at once. You have these huge, giant fields of pattern recognition, and chaos theory is an example of shifting out of this Newtonian mechanical, pool balls knocking into each other, into these huge geometrical pictures that have nothing to do with causality, but they have to do with the geometry that is behind what happens in dynamical processes, what happens when you get this sudden buildup of all these things and suddenly you get a thunderstorm. There's no causality, there's just these tiny little causes which gather up and suddenly bifurcate and explode, and you get a whole new system. You can look at water boiling and apply the same phenomenology.
You could say that it's just the abundance of stimulation that causes this shift. With any of those, the abundance of events, the sheer number increasing, and we can certainly say that the number, the number of stimuli in the world today is so much higher than it was in the turn of the century.
Right.
So, although and refraining from calling that a cause, one can say that certainly is part of it.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why I asked the question is that, I kind of just wanted to have a better overview.
Sure. Yeah, that's really what Marshall McLuhan's work was all about, was dedicated to, just that question. He would turn up on interviews and people would ask him, what's the new thing now? And he would say, well, you have to look at our society now, it's just bombarded by information.